Hello once again, everyone. Can you believe it? We've made it all the way to chapter 10 in your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This chapter is entitled Democracy in America, 1815 to 1840. This first section is entitled The Triumph of Democracy. The focus question for this section is, what were the social bases for the flourishing democracy of the early mid-19th century? The period of the early 19th century was one marked by many new challenges to those old property qualifications for voting. This was facilitated by the shift in attitudes of personal independence from owning property to the ownership of oneself. The spread of wage labor helped to facilitate this shift, as wage laborers generally held very little property, so therefore could not qualify for voting under those old property qualifications. Of course, this shift was mostly in the North, where wage labor dominated. The South was much slower to remove many of those property qualifications from voting. Of course, this shift in this attitude was also influenced by that transcendentalist message of individualism that we spoke about in the last lecture series. By 1840, more than 90% of adult white men in the United States could vote. The country, lacking any sort of religious or ethnic unity, began to look towards democratic political institutions to impart a new sense of overarching American identity, to try to unite the country. The uniqueness of this new democratic impulse in American society was noted by an early 19th century French writer named Alexis de Tocqueville, who did a tour of the United States in the early 19th century and wrote a book called Democracy in America that really illuminated a lot of these very unique features of American society, especially from the point of view of a European aristocrat like Alexis de Tocqueville. In many ways, he can be seen as sort of an early sociologist, back before sociology was a defined scholarly discipline. He made key observations about early U.S. society and political institutions. He noted that in the United States, democracy encouraged individual initiative, a belief in equality, at least of opportunity, if not of outcomes, and this idea of a robust political sphere with voluntary or private organizations devoted to improving society. He also noted that the idea of that sovereignty, the very right to rule, resided in the mass of ordinary citizens, was radical in Western society, and again, especially from that European aristocratic point of view. And Alexis de Tocqueville really helped to spread the ideas of democracy in the United States throughout the rest of the world, and really helped to initiate new movements elsewhere that began to adopt many of these same sorts of ideas. The spread of democratic ideas and this democratic impulse was greatly encouraged by another revolution spreading throughout the United States in the early 19th century, this one being the Information Revolution. The market revolution and new technologies like the telegraph and the steam-powered printing press expanded the influence of the press, which also helped to expand the public sphere itself. This initiated a new style of sensationalized journalism that catered to popular audiences. Advances in technologies made periodicals like newspapers and magazines much cheaper, and more people could afford them. Also, the expansion of the National Postal Service and low postal rates facilitated this expansion of the press and of journalism. The growth of organized political parties also fueled that expansion. This growth of the press allowed more people to participate in wider public debates and influence organized reform movements. People would engage with each other in op-ed pieces and letters to the editors and actually have social and political conversations back and forth through those mediums, in many ways much like we do today with Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. Of course, back then at a much slower pace, but of a similar purpose and with a similar effect on society. The growth in the numbers of people who participated in politics led to a redefinition once again of the term freedom and who possessed that privilege. Property no longer defined who was free and who was not once those property qualifications began to fall away from the legal structures. This new democratic ethos welcomed and absorbed native-born white men and white immigrants, which helped further solidify the very concepts of whiteness, as it had to be determined who among these immigrants actually qualified as white or not. Barriers were reducing for white immigrants, but they were solidifying more and more for women and non-white men. The grounds for political exclusion shifted from economic dependency to natural incapacity. Gender and race increasingly became synonymous with the incapacity for self-government. Just as gender and race began to be seen more and more as indicators of this incapacity for self-government, whiteness itself increasingly became synonymous with democracy itself. This spread of this egalitarian democratic ethos, at least amongst white men, helped to diminish social distinctions between the classes, while racial distinctions increased exponentially in American society. This period also saw the rise of a new scientific racism. New ideas of racial superiority and inferiority emerged from the nascent scientific thought of the times. Now keep in mind, modern science was still very much in its infant stages at this time and was really groping around and feeling around for how to describe scientifically differences between human beings. These sorts of ideas of scientific racism inspired new ideologies of white supremacy that began to filter through American society at the time. And this also led to new racial stereotypes that began to flourish in mass culture and spread through the mass press that was quickly rising in American society at the time, leading to such things as this overly racial caricature of African Americans in this Jim Crow figure you see here that emerged during this time. That concludes part 1 of our Chapter 10 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.